Yeah.
All right, folks, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Tommy Ferguson. I'm the Executive Director of Capital City Village, and I am very pleased to have you with us this afternoon. For those of you that might not be as familiar with Capital City Village, we are a local nonprofit, and we work with seniors in the community to provide them with services and programs like this one that will help them age well in their own homes. And so aging in place is really a priority. And so we help folks do that by volunteer services as well as programs for enrichment and socialization. So again, if you're not familiar, please get some more information at capitalcityvillage.org. And again, thank you for giving us some of your time this afternoon. So we have, this is a relatively new series that we've just started this summer, a summer writers series focusing on writers of all sorts. And we termed it The World into Words. And for me, I think that that's what a lot of writers do, is that they're able to translate. They're able to let us see the world through their words. And that's why I value great writers so much as a reader. And so this is part of our program series. But to do the introduction today, I'm going to turn to Phyllis Waddle, who knows our guest speaker very well. And so again, thank you for giving us your time this afternoon. We are recording the session. So for those folks that miss it, we will have it posted on our website and our YouTube channel very shortly. We're also trying to stream it on Facebook today. So if you have any mishap or get kicked off or know of somebody that wanted to be here but couldn't, please let them know. We will have another opportunity to see this program. So without further ado, I'm going to mute myself and remind all the participants, if you're not speaking or asking questions later, please do go ahead and mute yourself while our guest speaks. And Phyllis, if you would do the introduction, I will turn it over to you.
Okay. I'd like to introduce to you my friend Peggy Pickle, who is going to be telling us about co-writing with her father his memoir titled Jake. Peggy's a native Austinite, which is a title that's become a badge of honor, and she's a graduate of the University of Texas, which is another badge of honor. She's married to Don Cook, who has been involved in Capital City Village for several years and served on the board of directors. Peggy's been involved in several of the fundraising events with us. Peggy's father, Jake Pickle, served in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing Texas' 10th Congressional District for 31 years, from 1963 to 1994. After his retirement in Congress, he and Peggy co-authored a book, Jake, about his life experiences, and it was published in 1997 by the University of Texas Press. We can all imagine how many fascinating stories he had to tell from 31 years in Washington, D.C. and at home in Texas. Peggy's experiences writing Jake taught her a lot about compiling a family memoir. She says, doing so needn't be an intimidating process. It starts with just one story. Our thanks to Peggy for sharing with us today the wonderful experience of working with her father to write Jake. It will inspire all of us to tell our own stories. Thank you, Peggy, for sharing your experience and your knowledge with us.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Peggy Pickle. My husband, Don Cook, is standing behind me. He's a member of CCV. You're probably here because either you knew Jake Pickle or you wanted to compile the stories of your own life. Some want to write a memoir for your family. Maybe some of you even would like to publish something. This is the story of how I did both. My late father was James Gerald Jake Pickle. He served Texas 10th Congressional District in the United States House of Representatives for 31 years. He was elected in November 1963, the same month that President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Daddy retired from Congress in 1995. He was a close associate of Lyndon Johnson. As the president's congressman, he voted for landmark legislation, which became known as the Great Society. My father was only one of 5 Southern members of Congress to vote for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He always says that was the best vote he ever cast. Serving in Congress was the joy of my father's life. He worked holidays. He was always on call, even in the middle of the night. He became famous for his constituent service and his excellent staff. I know we have Linda K. Keeling with us today, and she was a member of that excellent staff. He was a great congressman. I have to say, he was a great congressman. But before his election to Congress, my father already had this other very long and productive career. Like many other children of the Depression, he was a poor boy who put himself through college. In 1937, he was elected student body president of the University of Texas. He served 4 years in the Pacific during World War II. He was co-founder of Austin radio station KVET. He had his own public relations firm. He served as Texas Employment Commissioner, was executive director of the State Democratic Executive Committee, and he managed the political campaigns of numerous state officials, including Governor Price Daniel, Alan Shivers, and John Connally. That was a lot. The years passed, I grew up, the Johnson administration became the Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, and Clinton administrations. And Daddy was still in Washington plugging away, putting his constituents first. When he finally announced his retirement from Congress in 1995, the idea of writing a book came to me. At the time, a slim volume was on the bestseller list. It was Harvey Pinnock's Little Red Book. It was life lessons experienced through the game of golf as taught by golf legend Harvey Pinnock. I bet a lot of you remember that book. So I thought, hey, we could write a book like that. We could sort of write a how-to book about ethical politics. So I talked to Daddy about us co-authoring a book, but he was kind of reluctant. He was busy. Also, he had witnessed other political friends write sort of self-important memoirs that nobody cared about once they left office. He didn't want to be one of those guys. Also, although he never said this, he wasn't sure that I could pull it off. But he loved me, and I was very persistent, so he agreed. Once we started working together, I realized that a how-to book on politics would be preachy and dull. Eventually, our project evolved into something different than either of us had imagined. I wanted to preserve the stories of my father's life. He wanted to preserve funny political stories, his and other politicians. So to humor me, he allowed me to lead him into personal areas of his own life. Growing up in West Texas, living at Little Campus, the University of Texas poor boy dorm, voting for the Civil Rights Act, giving eulogies for John Connally and Lyndon Johnson, and many other stories. I didn't think of writing a book so much as I thought about getting these particular stories down in print. So I approached each story as a separate entity. Each story became a chapter. Some stories were 2 pages, others were 15 pages. 6 months later, we had compiled 39 stories, which was 39 chapters. And my God, we had a book. If you have read this book, you will know a lot about Jake Pickle and maybe even a little bit about me. Most of you in this room are not interested in writing or publishing professionally, but I bet a lot of you are interested in writing down the stories for your families, and probably some of you already have. In order to do this, you have to come up with a good working arrangement. If you're working alone, like writing your own stories, you could write on a computer or a typewriter if you still have one, or in longhand on a yellow legal pad. If you're interviewing another person, it gets more complicated. Many people tape record interviews. My husband, Don Cook, interviewed his grandmother on tape shortly before she died because Don, who lived in another state, knew that it was the last time he would ever see her. But I refused to interview my father on tape, and this is why. By the time we began working on Jake, Daddy had had a 50-year, half a century long professional career. He was used to dictating letters. In his office, his word was law with a capital L. He said something and somebody scurried it off and wrote it down verbatim. But at the same time, he was loosey-goosey on dates and details. He just liked to tell the stories. I knew that the stories would be read or might be read by people who didn't know Jake Pickle or Texas politics. So I needed to add background. Also, I wanted the voice of our book to sound natural, the way he really talked. So the method my father and I eventually developed was he would sit beside my computer and he would talk. He had no trouble with that part. In advance, I made a list of subjects that I wanted to cover. These subjects were my own invention, and they were from all stages of his life. Some were about important historical events. Some were simple family lore. Others were funny political stories. Whenever Daddy remembered that he was, quote, writing a book, his wonderful verbal style became very stilted. So it worked better for him to be a raconteur and for me to ask questions. Often I would prompt him by saying something like, let's talk about Uncle Gus and Uncle Arthur and the White House grocery. I'm a fast typist, so as Daddy talked, I would write down words and phrases, not sentences, just words and phrases. I didn't try to get it verbatim. Later, I would print my notes, study them, and begin composing. I wrote in my father's first-person voice, which I knew well, although the stories were not always exactly word for word how he told them, certainly not an organization. With a little experimentation, you will find the method that works best for you. Ahead of time, make a list of the things you want to talk about and you want your family to know. Then write your stories down one at a time. If you do enough of them, you will have your own personal history. When you finish, get your stories proofed and typed. Even the prettiest longhand is discouraging to read, especially years later by people who don't know your handwriting. They might not bother. There are plenty of starving students out there who do word processing at a reasonable fee. When you have a clean printed text, take it to Kinko's or Office Max and have it copied. You can buy plastic binders at Office Max and you put each copy of your stories into a separate binder. And then you've got a memorable gift for your family, one that will outlive you and probably outlive them too. One problem you're bound to encounter is the issue of family scandal. There's one story in my book The first time I met LBJ, which is mildly risque, it's vintage LBJ. It's also accurate. Before I sat down to write it, I asked our editor at UT Press, how much of this should we say? And she said, always tell the truth. Always tell the truth. As Southerners, most of us, especially we women, are taught to avoid unpleasantness. But what I learned is that today's scandal is tomorrow's history. A couple of generations down the road, almost anything has less sting or no sting. Besides, revelations may help descendants struggling with difficult issues. At the very least, it makes people and situations real. For instance, I had a maternal great-grandfather, dead long before I was born, who had a fabulous temper. I didn't see it, but I heard about it. 165 years ago, he was rumored to have killed a man in a gunfight dispute over a woman. My Uncle Chauncey would sometimes tell me, you know, Grandpa Lamb shot a man. But my Aunt Genevieve, who was embarrassed by the whole scandal, was quick to shush him up. She would say, hush, Chauncey. Nobody is interested in that old family stuff. Every time this happened, I'd pipe up and I'd say, I am. And then Genevieve would turn and say to me fiercely, no, you're not. So I never found out the details about Grandpa Lamb. And now they're all dead and I never will. And you know, that was a shame. I would have liked to have known. Put down what is important and don't let embarrassment curtail your story. Like my editor said, the truth is always fair. And incidentally, although Daddy and I did not write a how-to book about politics, we got in a little advice anyway. I refer to Jake's rules in the book's introduction and to chapter 19, which was listening for the bell. The bell in that case means your moral compass. There's one more thing I want to say before I ask for questions. I haven't told you how much fun doing this is. You will discover things about your family and yourself that you did not know. You will laugh, you may even cry. You will lay old ghosts to rest. Our book was published in 1997 by the University of Texas Press. It's called Jake. It wasn't the flop that Daddy had feared. The first year after publication, he and I did over 40 book signings and TV appearances. Jake may still be available through UT Press, although it's probably in paperback now. Used copies can still be ordered through Amazon. Even today, lines from the book are quoted in newspaper stories about Jake Pickle's career or about politics at the time. And I'm going to confess to you, that's still a thrill to me. My father lived to be 91 years old. From the day that Jake was published until his death 8 years later, people were still regularly bringing him the book to autograph. Oh, he loved that. I'm grateful that we had this experience together. You may never publish, but I predict that you'll get a lot of satisfaction from getting your own stories down and sharing them. And besides, it's going to be your own version. So now, maybe you have some questions for me about how I did this and the difficulties. So fire away.
And folks, just a reminder, there are several ways to ask questions. You can either type something in the chat section, or you can use the raise hand function at the bottom of your screen. There's an icon that says reactions. Or if you want to, wave your hand and we'll scan the screens here and you can jump on in and ask your questions. I think I see one first from Mart Hoffman.
Sure. Peggy, thank you.
Mark?
One of my, Sue and I talked about this. Did you use an editor?
Yes, we had several editors at UT Press, all of which are retired by now. But what happened is he was so reluctant to do this book because he thought it would reflect badly on his career and people might accuse him of taking advantage of the situation. Do you remember what happened to Jim Wright back about that time? So he kept hedging me. So he and Beryl went out of town for about a week. And I had 5 or 6 stories written. And as soon as he left town, I made an appointment with the editor, the director of UT Press, who was Johanna somebody. I made an appointment and told her I had some books and Jake Pickle was thinking about writing a book. And she, oh, please come in. She said, right away. Oh, yes. So she came in. He didn't know a thing about it. And I left her these 5 or 6 stories to read. And she said, we'll read these and call you back in about a week. And I said, okay. So I went home and the next morning the phone rang and she said, we want to print it. We know we want to print it. So I said, okay, let's draw up a contract. So she drew up a contract. And then she assigned us an editor. So we had a person that worked on the layout, how to lay out, and I was responsible for gathering all the photos. And then we had a person who actually edited my copy. I had been writing professionally for years at that point, so I didn't need a whole lot of cleanup, but I did need some. You know, a good editor is very valuable. So when he came back to town, I went and went over with the contract and said, well, look, we have this contract for this book and we have an editor. And he said, oh, I don't know about this. I just wanted to write these stories down and put them in a drawer. I said, well, I'm not writing this to put it in a drawer. I want to publish it. Well, I don't know. He used to have this habit of kind of rubbing his face like this, you know, I don't know. And finally, I talked him into doing it. But when we signed that contract with UT Press, we had an editor assigned to us who was great, and we had a layout person.
Right.
And then at the end of the book, I told them that I just couldn't do all the footnote notes. You know, there were a lot of people mentioned and dates and laws, and they got a professional person to do that. So I didn't have to do it, which really would have been a lot. That would have been another year right there.
Wow.
So yeah, we had very good staff to help us. It's great. And then they came up with the book. The cover, I don't know if you can see it. It's a really good,
Yeah,
really good cover. There's a pickle pin on it. And I was pleased with that too. So we got the best of help. And once he got on board, he was real happy to do it. But he had to be convinced that this was a book that people would buy and want to read, and it, you know, was not taking advantage of his position. He was very concerned about that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Looks like in the chat section, John Barry had checked in and said Joanna Hitchcock was apparently.
Joanna Hitchcock.
Yeah.
I haven't seen her. I ran into her a few times, but I haven't seen her in years.
Yeah.
I hope she's doing okay. She was the director at UT Press. John knows what happened to her. Well,
okay, yeah, Joanna's doing fine, and as you probably know, she's quite a character herself, and had a relative on the Titanic, and she's writing her own. She's writing her own memoir about that.
Well, could you tell her I said hi?
I will do that. I will do that, Peggy. Yes.
With everybody we worked with at UT Press was a pleasure.
Was your editor Jim Burr?
Was what?
Was the person that actually helped you edit, was that Jim Burr?
It was another woman. I don't know Jim.
Okay, no. Because my wife Ingrid had a lot of friends at UT Press for a long while. Yeah.
So then I had all these photographs, hundreds of photographs, which one to put in, which ones not to put in. And then I had to do all the cut lines, and the cut lines are what are under the photograph that describes what's going on. I had to write those. So at that point, I went to the layout person and I said, here's here's what I've got. What would you like? And they kind of picked the ones they wanted. And then I did the cut lines for them.
All right, and then I'll scan through and see if there are any other questions. Keep in mind that if your video is not on, I can't see you wave. So you will need to use the raise hand function or simply unmute and jump in with your question.
Here's LK.
LK, yeah, go right ahead, LK.
Peggy, please tell Bergen hello.
How are
And then also, you probably remember that my stepson, my
Yes.
niece, my then husband was financial officer for Jake, and my close friend, Molly Schulman, lifelong friend, worked for Jake for almost all the years he was in office. And then my brother, Jay Michael, was Jake's chief of staff for 10 years. And what's important about that is Prophet and others were just there a couple of years, but Michael loved Jake so much that he stayed 10 years. And I'm going to tell you a little story about your father that you may not know. And that is, I had the privilege in about 1985 of being in Acapulco at a house party with Jake and Beryl. And your dad was so much fun, and he teased me frequently. And so what happened was the staff, and of course he had the best staff in DC, the best staff in Austin for sure. And his staff had prepared him a tape of country western songs. So for the whole week, Jake would play the harmonica and sing sometimes, and it was great fun. And on the last day that we were there, he was standing at the window looking out at the beautiful Acapulco Bay. And he said, you know what? This is the most wasted week I have ever spent in my entire life.
Yeah, but he had a real good time anyway, didn't he? Yeah, he told me one time that he took a cruise. He and Beryl took a cruise with retired Governor Price Daniel and his wife, Jean, because the Daniels like to cruise. And so they talked Jake and Beryl. And Daddy came home after a week and he just said, I didn't get it. I don't understand the attraction. And I said, well, what do you mean? She said, well, people on cruises, they don't do anything. They just sit around, they eat, they play shuffleboard. You know, what's good about that? He didn't understand it at all. The whole concept of lying around doing nothing was just completely foreign to him. He always had to be doing something. And I think that was the only cruise he ever took.
How long did the process take?
Once I got the idea and I got him to start talking to me, I was obsessed with it. And I would go to bed at night and I swear to God, I would wake up in the morning with whole sentences in my head. And I would go straight from the bed to my computer and write them down. I mean, it would almost write itself. It was real easy to write. And I guess I had all the stories done in 6 months, and probably less than that.
Did they do all 39 chapters?
Yes, we had a couple of other chapters that were just a little more off color that they knew didn't make it into the book. But the hard part was really doing the layout and design, and that took more time, and I wasn't so involved in that except for giving permission. But writing it was easy. And I think all of you who want to write your family memoirs, just try to write it the way you talk and just put it down. And you can clean it up later if you want to, but really, I had no trouble writing. It was just, I always said it was like falling off a log because I knew him so well and I knew how he talked, and I knew a lot of the stories, but you know, his whole life he had used certain phrases that I didn't know where they came from. And when we did the book, I all of a sudden understood where that particular phrase came from, what part of his life. And it was kind of interesting. It was fun to find that out. And then after we finished writing it, we'd be sitting around and he'd tell me some story that I'd never heard before. And I would be just furious because I wanted to put it in the book, but it was already gone to galleys then and too late. So just don't try to clean it up or make it sound elegant. Just write it the way you talk to your family. And then later you can go back and fix the grammatical errors in it. But I just feel like you want to have your own family voice in there. You want it to sound like you.
Peggy, have you got any untold yet stories about Jake and LBJ?
Yeah, I have a story about LBJ, but nobody's ever put it in a book, and I don't really think it's book worthy. But he was a very large figure in my father's life, and Daddy owed a lot to him. Lyndon Johnson gave Jake a chance when he was just this young green kid
Right.
out of college to have a job. And he met all these people that he knew the rest of his life, became friends like John Conley. But in a way, Daddy, after President Johnson died, in a way, it sort of liberated my father in that he could become his own congressman. He didn't have to worry about what the president thought about anything. He could vote the way he wanted to. And that was not really a problem because they both thought the same about legislative issues. They were both for civil rights. So it's not like he changed that much. It's just that I don't know how to explain it. It was just liberating. I have a story when I went to, when Lucy Nugent, she's not Nugent now, when Lucy Johnson got married to Pat Nugent, this was 1966. My then husband and I were invited to the wedding, and then a group of Texas friends were invited back to somebody's house afterwards to have like kind of an after party. This was after the reception. And the president was there, and Mrs. Johnson was there, and all the Secret Service people. And a lot of the old Johnson crowd was there that were in town for the wedding. The wedding was in Washington. And it was at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Willard Deason. And Willard Deason was a man who had helped found KVET radio with Daddy many years before. He knew Willard Deason very well. Anyway, we're all in this big room and we're all sitting around talking. And it's a happy time. Everybody's happy because the wedding had gone well. And, you know, everybody, we're sort of celebrating. And I remember that somebody brought the president a little round bowl of nut bread. I mean, maybe it wasn't nut bread, but it was something kind of like that. And they brought it to him, and he was talking in a chair, and he was, you know, extolling this and that. You know, he was kind of a big talker. And somebody brought him this little bowl of nut bread, and then he realized that there wasn't a table by President Johnson's chair. He had forgotten that it was just the chair and the president in it. The president was waving his hands and talking like this. He had a drink. And so the man kind of hesitated. He didn't know what to do. So finally he just stood there holding the nut bowl by the president's elbow. And he stood there for about 45 minutes holding this nut bowl. And once in a while, the president would reach over his hand and take a little bit. And he paid no attention to this man holding the nut bowl whatsoever. And I remember watching this from across the room, and nobody else was paying any attention. And I thought, that's power, you know, when somebody will stand there and hold your nut bowl for 40. Not many people would get that done for them. But anyway, see, like, it's a non-story, but it's just, when he was in the room, there was like an electric field.
That's right.
Everybody was very aware of him and what, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And no, he was in Austin. Rick's asking, yeah, if we were in the motorcade in Dallas. No, Daddy was in Austin because they were coming here to have a big dinner, and I have those tickets for the dinner that never happened. But Lyndon Johnson was, you know, literally bigger than life, and he was also taller than most people, and he just sort of sucked up all the oxygen of the room. And I don't mean that necessarily in a bad way. That's how powerful he was.
Yeah, he really was.
Yeah, but anyway, I remember that. And I remember the fabulous fellow holding the nut bowl stood there.
Sitting on the toilet and dipped his hand.
All right, I'm going to scan really quickly to see if there are any other questions. I would like to check in with a couple myself. So about the writing process, Peggy, so in the time that you were working with your father, making the notes, putting things together, trying to figure out how everything would fit. So a couple of questions. First of all, how did you know when you were done? Like, how did you come to like, okay, we're good, you know? And then the other question is, because there's just so much and you had such a history together, was there ever a point where you thought, gosh, I could have a whole other volume that's more the personal stories, the family histories, rather than the professional?
How I knew I was done was UT Press told me I was done, because they had all these piles of stories, and they said, oh, we think that's enough, because also to put a book out with photographs costs a lot more money. And that book back then, I'm trying to see how much it was. I think it was $25.95 or something like that, which is a lot of money. This is, years ago, because you have to have the photographs in there, and they're black and white, but still costs money to put photographs. And then also at the beginning of each chapter, there is a small photograph for each chapter. So you had a lot of photographs in here, and those cost money. So at some point, they said, we think we have enough. I could have written more. I mean, I could have gone on for, forever, because there's so many good stories about it. But they basically said, if we have much more, we're going to have to price the book out of its market. So that was the end of it. And toward the end of the book, he talks about, at the end of the book gets more personal, and it seemed a good way to end it. There's a story in there about my grandfather, Judge Kreitz, who was my mother's father, who helped raise me when my mother died. And to me, it's a very sweet story about the relationship between the two men, but it wasn't a political anecdote story. I mean, there was no punchline or anything like that. And Daddy didn't really understand those stories. He wanted a story with a punchline, but a lot of life stories don't have a punchline. But anyway, I could have written more, but UT Press said, no, we have enough. And I don't think there would have been an interest in a second volume. I really don't. But it's still selling.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to scan through. So just raise your hands. Okay, if you have any other questions. Oh, go ahead, Mart. Go
Okay.
right ahead.
Yeah.
Okay, Peggy, the book Rudder,
Yes, Earl.
Earl Rudder mentions about how he, your father, John Conley, and LBJ grew up in West Texas in somewhat of a hard scrabble existence, and then that really built their character to endure and master and become such great leaders. And I thought that was an interesting comment about them and about your dad.
Yeah, they were all self-made men that didn't come from prominent families with money. They came from hardworking families, but certainly Daddy's family didn't. His father was a grocer, and all the kids in the family worked. And I think he had a early appreciation for work. He was real goal oriented. He wanted to accomplish things. And I could only guess that Conley was the same way. But West Texas, if you're growing up back then, in the first half of the 20th century, it was hard scrabble, literally. And you had to work hard. And I think he was very grateful to have the chance. He came to the University of Texas, and he met a lot of people that stayed with him his whole life, his friends. And he always had a special feeling about the University of Texas because it gave him a chance. He was a poor boy that put himself through school, and he always had, he felt like the university was a member of his own family. It was this great big vague entity that was related to him, and he really did love it. He felt like he owed everything. And John and Conley were classmates. They ran each other's campaigns for student body. Daddy always said, I was elected first. And then he was John Conley's best man at his wedding. So they stayed friends all their lives. Toward the end of Conley's life, they politically were on different roads, but they stayed friends.
Peggy, you had a great story that you told me once about Jake's relationship with Luby's Cafeteria.
With who? With what?
With Luby's Cafeteria?
Oh, Luby's.
Yeah.
Luby's. Yeah, he loved to go to Luby's because there was, back in those days, when you went to Luby's, you had this long line of people waiting to get in. He just loved a long line because he could walk down the line, shake hands, which sounded horrible to me, but no, that was his idea of a good time shaking hands at Luby's. But he also was not much interested in money. And he didn't usually have more than a few dollars in his pocket because money just kind of wasn't on his radar screen. He kind of, so one of his big lines to me was, if you got some money, I'll take you to Luby's. That would mean that I'd pay for it and he'd work the line. And I'm glad that he didn't live to see Luby's kind of going downhill, but
Yeah.
somebody else has bought it now.
Oh, okay.
Is that the story you meant?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, he really liked he liked this sort of meet and greet stuff that a lot of political people don't like to do and don't do now. But he loved talking to people and being with people. And if you came to Washington and you wanted to tour the Capitol, he was happy to do that for you. I mean, it was kind of, he was a very gregarious person.
Mhm.
Oh, yeah. Yes, Rick's asking if he stayed in touch with UT. And he got UT some real good tax breaks that saved the university millions. So UT loved him. But it was mutual. Yeah, he stayed in touch. He stayed in touch with everybody. And all of Jake's boys would get together. Michael, when he was in town, they would all come over and visit with him and tell stories. They still tell stories. If you get a bunch of those people together now, they're going to go in the corner and tell Jake stories. That hadn't changed. But they're not necessarily the stories you would put in a book. Anyway, I enjoyed doing it. And I guess my whole message is those of you who are thinking about writing this stuff down, don't look at it as a big, long book. Just look at it, just compile a lot of stories and arrange them chronologically. And if you do enough, you'll have a story of your life or people that were in your life. I never looked at it that I was writing a book. I just looked at it. I looked at it story by story by story, and that worked out real well.
Was there anything else that you thought of afterwards or that you talked with your father about afterwards that you really do wish you could have included, if you'd had the opportunity or limitless page count?
I don't think so. There were things toward the end of his life I wished I had asked him, but there were more personal things that were not things that I would have put him in the book. He lost his wife and he was a very young man starting his career, and I was only 6. And he talked about her, but not a whole lot. And I don't think I would have put that in the book. But when he was old and I was trying to talk about it, it was still painful. So we didn't go into it too much. But no, I think I pretty well covered. Maybe Don, do you remember anything I should have put in there?
Well, I think Jimmy has a question. Jimmy, if you want to go ahead and chime in.
Well, I am not a book person, but I just thank you for what you did for all the family members. Must be so very, very grateful and appreciative. My daughter has a writing, she's really good at writing.
Oh, good.
And she gave, I'm telling the rest of the CCV members, if you don't want to write a whole book and a memoir and everything, she gave my husband and I both pre-printed books that had questions about your past and your history, your memories, that she begged and begged us to do. And we never did, just too busy. And when he was on his deathbed, literally, she got that book and went and asked him and wrote in some of those things. So, and we've got mine under the couch right now. We get started and then, but that can be a way to get some memories, at least for your family, of things that are gone once we're gone. So,
well, that's, and it's important to try to remember dates if you can. And he didn't care about dates. I'd say, when was this? Oh, I don't know. Back then he'd wave his hands, but people kind of want to know dates. But I think that's very interesting. She sounds about as persistent as I was. She wanted to get it down.
Well,
Of course
and
she
then I had the,
did, and she's wanting to know the answers to her questions. I think that's great.
did you know Fred Moore at UT? He was very involved in historical. He was the president of Mobil Oil,
Spell it.
and then
M-O-E-R.
no, Moore,
No,
Fred Moore.
I don't think
And when he retired from Mobil, he moved to Austin because of UT, and he also was one of those West Texas guys from Comanche, and but he wrote his memoir and had autographed copies for all of his, his two daughters and then grandchildren. And I remember thinking, what a wonderful gift that was, so
it is a gift. And remember, you're writing it not just for your children, but for their children and for
Yeah.
people that won't be born for 100 years. If somebody hangs on to it.
yeah. Well, UT Press definitely, and then they were also very involved with the donations at Baylor. So
Right.
that was where all his
That's a
books
great
went.
story. I'm glad to hear that.
Okay. Thank you for your talk and
You're welcome.
inspiration.
It was a pleasure. It really was.
Well, Peggy, before we let you go, there is one more question from John. He says, did you feel that you needed to describe a bit about life in West Texas for younger people who perhaps wouldn't understand what it was like? So in other words, yeah, trying to, kind of make that, pull that pieces of the past basically into a current context to give people more insight.
The first chapter in the book is called West Texas Roots, and it's exactly about that. It's growing up poor in West Texas and in a large family, and how everybody had to work. His hometown was Big Spring, but they moved around in the first decade of the 20th century because his father was trying to find work. And his father herded sheep, and he even herded goats one time, and then he worked as a roustabout in an oil drilling rig, and he finally got a business in West Texas selling vegetables at the train depot in Big Spring, and it was so successful that he rented a store, and they had a grocery there in Big Spring, and they named the grocery the White House Grocery. It wasn't named after the White House in Washington. It was named that because it was a white house. And that became the family salvation. And he worked in this grocery, and all the kids worked in the grocery for years. That's what paid everybody, that paid their expenses. But he talked a lot about how they didn't have any money, and, everybody was expected to work. And I remember we went back to Big Spring for a family reunion. It was all Jake's siblings except one lived into their mid-90s, and his sister Judith lived to 102. So they all had long lives. They were horses, every one of them. And we went back for somebody's 80th birthday reunion, and I drove by the White House Grocery, and it made me sad because it was just a kind of a dilapidated building, and there was this old guy standing out in front smoking a cigarette, drinking a can of beer. And I thought of all the happy times that Daddy and his family had there. But on the other hand, it was still standing. So, yeah, growing up in West Texas was a formative experience. And I think he was very proud of his hometown. He was very proud of being from West Texas. But, once he saw Austin with the trees and the lakes, he never went home. He was an Austinite. Yeah, I grew up here. Yeah. I mean,
It's true for some.
He was an
True for so many of
guy.
us. Well, I was just saying thank you for your time today. I was going to scan just really quickly in case there's other questions, but this has been incredible. This has been great for the insight.
Seeing Linda, and I enjoyed seeing Henry. He's not on the screen right now. Phyllis, good to see you. Everybody, Patricia, a lot of familiar faces up there. Thank you for tuning in, and don't be intimidated by this. Just sit down and write.
Peggy, this is great. Yeah, I think, and hopefully you've inspired some folks to do just that. So thank you again so much for giving us your time.
Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks very much, Peggy.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for being here.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I said leave meeting, and I think I'm.
Bye, Jane.